Hello and welcome to the Roundtable. Today we'll be discussing China's halt of urea solution exports to Korea and President Yoon Suk Yeol's state visit to the Netherlands. To have in-depth discussion of these issues, we have Dr. Kim Hana, Professor of International Studies of Sewang University in the studio. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me again.
Now I'm very glad to introduce Dr. Lee In-bok, Professor of Political Science at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. Welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here.
Most of our viewers must have recently heard the word urea solution, which has been mentioned in the news quite often recently. It is because China's customs authorities suspended the export of the substance to Korea early this month, which is the second time the Chinese authority made the same decision. So industrialists in South Korea are concerned about a possible shortage crisis like the one that hit them hard 2 years ago. So Professor Lee, could you tell the viewers about the urea solution first?
Right, so this urea solution, also often called diesel exhaust fluid, is a crucial component in reducing nitrogen oxide for environmental protection and reducing emissions. So this is an integral part to diesel engines and cars to meet environmental regulations regarding emissions. Myself actually drive a diesel car, and I'm pretty familiar with the current status with these urea solutions. So as you mentioned, in October 2021 in the past, we have first experienced the shortage of urea solutions. At that time, the government was basically citing concerns about domestic provision of these goods, as well as some environmental regulations that they had to meet. So we have experienced already this sort of stopping of the exports of urea solutions. And now, as you mentioned, we are experiencing kind of a similar concern that is looming in front of us as the Chinese have stopped exporting this at the same amount in the recent months.
Professor Kim, then the Chinese authorities' decision to stop the export of urea solutions to Korea for the second time. What is the reason behind this decision?
So according to statistics, it's because India is buying up a lot of the urea and in order to manufacture fertilizer. So in September 2021, China's urea exports surged to more than 1 million tons, and 75% of this went to India. In September of this year, China's urea shipments nearly quadrupled to 1.18 million tons in a month, and India purchased about 860,000 tons.
So, Dr. Lee, why India buying up so much urea solutions this year?
So I think one thing that we have to consider is that India is still a very agriculture dominant economy. So they need these fertilizers to make sure that they can continue the production of the agricultural goods to meet both the domestic market needs as well as export needs as well. And urea, obviously, as mentioned before, is an important part of providing fertilizers for these agricultural activities. So that might have led to partially what can be seen as kind of a stockpiling of these urea solutions by the Indians.
So, Professor Kim, according to the official explanations given by Chinese government, the Indian government, then this is just a market-driven rational choice, not stockpiling the resources or the economic retaliations to South Korea.
So I think it's still too early to tell. The official account of the government is that the Chinese government is trying to prioritize its domestic consumption. Of course, we have seen natural resources being used as a weapon and used for some political gain or some political objective. So at the moment, it's too early to tell. And on December 1st, China State Council held an executive meeting, which was presided over by Premier Li Chang. And during this meeting, there was a discussion to revise the mineral resources law where they decided to approve of it. And the key point of this meeting and the revision was that they want to increase mineral productions and domestic reserves right now.
The current situation appears to be the result of China and India preemptively taking mercantilist measures to protect their domestic markets, having experienced serious disruption in global supply chains of natural resources during the COVID-19 pandemics. Dr. Lee, there is a speculation or the expectation that These are not market-driven, rational decisions by Chinese government, but it's a weaponization of natural resources. Are there any cases that China actually use natural resources as a political and security weapons?
I think it's very difficult to tell whether there is a clear intent or motivation to use resources as a kind of weapon in the global stage. It was mentioned earlier also, there is still the domestic need to be met. For example, the Chinese economy is sort of the growth is slowing down. You need those resources to make sure that the domestic prices can be stabilized, domestic market can be stabilized as well. There is also partially a domestic political consideration as well. So the Chinese government has made statements about how it is trying to move to a more kind of environmentally aware governance system as well, multiple times. So sort of using these resources in a more domestic context may also be behind some of their motivations. At the same time, I think it is difficult to say that there's no diplomatic or global considerations that the Chinese government is making other than the domestic considerations. Some of these natural resources, the Chinese economy has a very strong kind of dominant position. So using these, it may be possible to try to meet some kind of a diplomatic objective, try to gain a superior hand when dealing with other governments. But again, in the sort of broader sense, I think it is very difficult to say whether this is purely kind of a weaponization or not.
Okay, Professor Kim, what do you think?
I completely agree with Professor Rhee. You know, in the domestic context, China's economy is deteriorating, which means that there are less employment opportunities. And when there's less stable jobs available, it can lead to more instability in the country overall. When there's less instability, it leads to less legitimacy of the government, especially because there aren't regularly held elections. And so the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, really relies on its economic profits in order to show it some of its legitimacy. So in that sense, I think that it is kind of appealing to resource nationalism. And on the international context, one example would be the Sino-Japanese dispute related to the Senkaku Islands, where China did exercise to a certain extent some weaponization by limiting exports of rare earth to Japan. So I think it is still a little too early to tell, but we're kind of seeing domestically and internationally that these kinds of things are happening right now.
Professor Rhee, I mean, South Korea as a country, doing business with China and the United States, but at the same time, a country that has experienced the retaliation by China after the deployment of the THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Missile Defense System, and the termination of Chinese government on the group tour programs to South Korea, must be quite alarmed and alerted for this kind of event, right? So what is the possibility for US and China actually waging a war, taking advantage of their own resources and industrial capacity, like the United States controlling the export and the development of semiconductors, and China retaliates with the control of the scarce natural resources, and how this kind of competition between great powers would impact countries like South Korea?
Wow, that's a very difficult question to answer. Let me try to think first about the implications for South Korea first. Obviously, it will lead to some level of supply chain disruptions. There will be a cost imposed to the Korean public because, if there are limitations and restrictions to imports and exports, then that obviously the burden will be given to the consumers with a higher price. So all of these will be sort of the direct impact of these kind of, so to speak, U.S.-China economic rivalry and the consequences of such. At the same time, whether this kind of the competition, if you will, between U.S. and China will lead to a greater kind of war or greater kind of intensity, I'm not necessarily that sure because the American economy is very dependent upon its economic relationship with the Chinese economy, and vice versa as well. The Chinese are also exporting much to the United States. These two countries and their economies are very closely intertwined. So it may be possible for us to see, say, intensified competition or even some hostility even in some specific sectors or industries. I do not believe that in a wider, broader sense, it will be beneficial for for either countries to escalate the situation, which will basically be very costly for the economies of both countries. At the same time, though, with the elections coming up in the United States and potentially depending on the election results, the U.S. seeing maybe a little more of a protectionist, nationalist kind of economic approach is very difficult to tell. But overall, in the broader sense of things, I think it is difficult to say that it's going to lead to a greater escalation.
Having foreseen such problems, the Korean government has already stepping up efforts to diversify importing routes and reduce nation's reliance upon China. Professor Kim, could you tell our viewers more specific about the South Korean government's actions?
The South Korean National Assembly passed the Supply Chain Stabilization Act this December, and this act essentially calls for the establishment of the commission to better ensure stable supply chain of key items. In addition to this, the South Korean government also created a special fund that would work to secure supply items and also provide investments for related facilities. And South Korea is also trying to diversify its import channels, which is a little difficult to do, but it will help better manage the supply of critical items. And one example of this is the participation of the IPEF, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
I see. Professor Ri, but on the pessimistic side, then the diversifying importing routes must be the ultimate solution to the problem, but in the short term, there must be a lot of other strategies to cope with the situation. Are there any examples that South Korean government can emulate, learning from other countries' experiences?
Right. As you mentioned, I think it may be pretty challenging and difficult to diversify the import routes in a very short period of time. At the same time, I think it may be difficult to think about only short-term solutions as well. We can sort of emulate, as you mentioned, what other countries are doing in the short, medium to long term. And I can think about a few examples from other countries. For example, we could think about sort of coming up with some kind of a strategic stockpiling strategy. So similar to the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we could try to create a reserve of some of these critical materials to buffer against supply disruptions. We could also try to invest more heavily, at least for the short term, into the domestic production capacity. So Australia has been doing pretty successfully making these investments for the domestic production capacity for some of these precious materials. Japan, on the other hand, has been leading some of the efforts in investments into research and development that can help them to sort of reduce the reliance on the imports from other countries, as well as thinking about substitution for, when possible, other materials that can be used in their places. So these are some of the solutions that we can consider. But again, I don't necessarily believe any of them can be a kind of immediate strategies that we can implement right away.
I see. So Kim, if you may lend South Korean government your wisdom, what would it be?
I completely agree with Professor Rin that there are a lot of examples. They might not be immediately implementable. But one example may be the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, and this act is essentially designed to reduce the United States' dependency on China's manufacturing by encouraging clean energy manufacturers within the U.S. And of course, there's been some backlash towards this domestically as well. So we have to take into account that even though it is a great example, it may not necessarily work in the Korean context. But it is very difficult to diversify import channels, so we have to try to take it with a grain of salt.
I see. The strategic competition between the US and China will likely deepen further, forcing countries around the world to choose sides. It is necessary for South Korea to come up with the fundamental measures to buffer itself from any fallout of strategic competition over natural resources in the future. Next, it's time to review last week's key global issues at a glance. Let's take a look at our folder selection. Last week saw a lot of events and issues worldwide. Professor Lee, what is your favorite picture?
If I had to choose one, I'd pick the one with the Santa.
Okay.
I used to bring my kids to meet the Santa, take photos every Christmas season, but haven't been able to do it in the past couple of years. But this photo brings back some nice memories.
I see. My favorite one is the BTS joining the military service. Because I do remember the day that I joined the boot camp, which is May 26th, and May 1st, the day that I finished my military service. I may forget my birthday, but I remember these days. What photograph is most impressive to you?
For me, it was the picture of President Yoon Suk Yeol wearing the anti-dust garment.
Okay.
He was wearing it in a clean room at ASML, which is the Dutch chip-making equipment manufacturer.
Yeah, let's stay with the topic. President Yoon Suk Yeol paid a 5-day state visit to the Netherlands from December 11th. His visit to ASML drew global attention, as he was the first foreign head of state to tour the clean room of the Dutch tech giant. Professor Kim, could you tell us more about the tech giant of the Dutch?
Yeah, so ASML is the only firm in the world that's capable of producing extreme ultraviolet or EUV lithography systems, which are needed for cutting-edge chip making. And lithography refers to the process of printing complex small patterns on wafers. And EUV lithography can print more elaborate designs with a very short wavelength of light. ASML is currently the exclusive supplier of EUV lithography systems, which are critical for chip production. And the company produces just some 40 units a year, which means that chip makers have to wait to get supplied with the equipment.
So Samsung produces chips, and the ASML provides the facility.
Right.
On the occasion of President Yoon Suk Yeol's visit, the global tech giant promised to boost cooperation with Korean companies. For example, Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix made respective agreements with ASML to carry out R&D projects. In addition, the two governments agreed to open and operate a semiconductor academy to nurture young talents in the industry. At a summit meeting, President Yoon Suk Yeol and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte signed a joint statement to forge Semiconductor alliance. Let's have a listen to the president speaking at a press conference.
이번에 저의 방문을 계기로 해서 이 협력 관계를 동맹 관계로 끌어올렸다고 보시면 됩니다. 한국과 네덜란드가 반도체 분야에서 세계 최고의 초격차를 만들어 나아가겠다는 뜻이라고 보시면 됩니다.
Professor Lee, as we heard that the word Semiconductor alliance enter into the joint statement, that's a pretty strong statement. What is the reason for Yoon Suk Yeol government to pursue such a high-level cooperation with the Netherlands in semiconductor industry?
I think President Yoon Suk Yeol's prioritization of semiconductor alliance at this time during his visit to the Netherlands reflects some strategic considerations. This ASML company, for example, is the only producer or supplier of this equipment and technology that can help the South Korean semiconductor industry to build a more kind of smaller and more powerful, efficient chips. And we're at a time when we're facing greater competition in the semiconductor industry as well. So this closer ties with the Netherlands would enable Korea to secure a more stable supply of this advanced technology and equipment that can also help us in sort of dealing with the current situation, especially with the China's rising semiconductor industry as well. With these cooperation and further the promises of closer ties, not just between the governments, but also the private companies and closer ties in the R&D aspect as well, I think is a kind of a crucial step in trying to ensure that the South Korean semiconductor industry can remain as competitive.
On the other side of the coin, that Professor Kim, I think there must be a lot of good reasons for Dutch government and the ASML forging semiconductor alliance with Korean counterparts.
Yeah, they definitely seem to be working in complementary towards one another. So South Korean chipmakers rely on ASML EUV machines, and ASML also relies on South Korea's chipmakers for the export of these EUV machines. So they're essentially in a win-win relationship where they complement each other, and this can be described as a chip alliance. And in this way, as Professor Lee mentioned earlier, South Korea can produce faster and more effective chips than its competitors. And even right now, Samsung's the largest company that produces dynamic random access memory chips, which are used in our everyday devices such as cell phones and laptops.
I see. As well as the chip alliance, the two countries signed 6 more MOUs, or Memoranda of Understanding, on enhancing cooperation in economy and security. What are they, and what's the most standout agreement?
Right. As you mentioned, there has been a number of MOUs signed during this visit. And if I had to pick one again, I think the most important should be really about the Semiconductor Alliance. So President Yoon vowed to upgrade the relationship between the two countries as a Semiconductor Alliance. And this is sort of a strategic partnership aimed to strengthen the cooperation in the semiconductor industry, which can be, as Professor Kim mentioned, crucial for both countries as well. But this, I think, does not stop at sort of just proclaiming that we have this alliance for this particular area. As mentioned briefly before, there is also a very strong emphasis on focusing on cooperation in the research and development sector as well. So Samsung and ASML, for example, has also signed an MOU related to establishing a research and development center in Korea in cooperation. And there has been further considerations about industrial level alliance or cooperation as well, and which is heavily focused on exchange of personnel and trying to put together efforts in research and development so that this can be kind of a relationship that can be forward-looking and further developing in the future.
One thing for me was that establishing the R&D center in South Korea will allow students from both countries to work together and also study together in relation to advanced technology, which can then further deepen the relationship between the two countries as well. And it seems as though the two countries will facilitate cooperation in nuclear energy, which will pave the way for South Korea's exports of nuclear reactors. And the Netherlands plans to buy 2 nuclear plants by 2035. So I think this will be an important part as well.
But the MOUs are not legally binding or enforceable. How can the Korean government achieve long-term substantial results from cooperation with the Netherlands? Dr. Lee, you go first.
Right, I think you raise a very important point. MOUs are not legally binding, they're not enforceable. So I think the follow-up stage, what we're going to do after these MOUs are going to be very important in this relationship. I think first, sort of thinking about strategic implementation plans will be very important. So because MOUs are sort of broader statements about the agreed upon directions, it'll be important to think about what are the clear timelines, milestones, action plans that we can come up with together between the two countries. So maybe thinking about some kind of progress assessments or some kind of joint working groups together will be very important. At the same time, having the different stakeholders to be more closely involved will be, I think, also a crucial step in really trying to reap the fruits out of this MOUs. So beyond the government agencies, this will involve private companies, research institutions, industry associations, maybe also students, as Professor Kim mentioned, encouraging joint projects and thinking about what are the next steps that we can try to concretely build together.
Right. So Professor Lee mentioned the steps after the MOU. So in addition to that, the MOU itself, in many different fields, will be important as well. So the two countries will not only complement one another in terms of semiconductors, but also in nuclear energy development. And they may also there's potential cooperation for the two to work together in terms of cutting-edge technology and global supply chains. But I think if we kind of think about it from an international perspective, we're also going to have to see the changing stance of the U.S.'s foreign policy towards this as well. Right now, Korea's foreign policy approach works or aligns with the U.S., but depending on what happens with the U.S. presidential elections next year, this may also change. So I think we have to be wary and be on the lookout for this as well.
From mineral resources to high-tech semiconductors, Countries around the world are striving to secure stable supply chains. In order to prevent a global supply crisis, nations need to better cooperate and communicate based upon diplomacy. Professor Lee and Professor Kim, thank you so much for sharing your insights and analysis on these important topics today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with the latest news. As you can see our studio design, we are ready to celebrate happy holidays, and we wish same to you. Happy holidays and goodbye.